In a little while they came to the point on the east road where they had taken leave of Bombadil, and they hoped and half expected to see him standing there to greet them as they went by. But there was no sign of him, and there was a grey mist on the Barrow Downs southwards and a deep veil over the old forest, far away. They halted, and Frodo looked south wistfully. "I should dearly like to see the old fellow again," he said. "I wonder how he is getting on." "As well as ever, you may be sure," said Gandalf, quite untroubled, and, I should guess, not much interested in anything that we have done or seen, unless perhaps our visits to the Ents. "There may be a time later for you to go and see him, but if I were you, I should press on now for home, or we will not come to the Brandywine Bridge before the gates are locked." "But there aren't any gates," said Mary, "not on the road. You know that quite well. There's the Buckland gates, of course, but they'll let me through that at any time." "There weren't any gates, you mean," said Gandalf. "I think you will find some now. And you might have more trouble even at the Buckland gate than you think. But you'll manage all right. Goodbye, dear friends. Not for the last time. Not yet. Goodbye." He turned Shadowfax off the road, and the great horse leaped the green dike that here ran beside it. And then, at a cry from Gandalf, he was gone, racing towards the Barrow Downs like a wind from the north. "Well, here we are, just the four of us that started out together," said Mary. "We have left all the rest behind, one after another. It seems almost like a dream that has slowly faded." "Not to me," said Frodo. "To me, it feels more like falling asleep again." Welcome, I'm Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, and this is The Forge of Tolkien. What does Frodo mean? He said, so Mary, we did the episode a number of episodes ago, talked to you about Tom Bombadil, and I told you that Tom Bombadil was very significant. Likewise, the things that happen to the hobbits while they're visiting Tom Bombadil, including the dreams that they have, which we're going to get back to, but let's think about this for a moment. So here they are, the hobbits have come back from their grand adventure, everything that happened between when they left Bombadil the first time, and now they're back on the road and nearby, and Frodo is thinking, I'd like to see Bombadil again, and Gandalf is saying he's not going to care, and then there's this just brief exchange between Merry and Frodo. "Well, we are here, just the four of us that started out together," right? So the original company was the four friends, and their first adventure was going out of the Shire through the gate into the old forest, and as I talked about in our discussion of Tom Bombadil, that with Bombadil they're told the story of Middle-earth, of creation, of the elves waking up under the stars, and that they're suddenly in fairy. They're in the story, right? And then after that, they have the incident with the Barrow Downs. Again, we're going to have to talk some more about that. But from the time that they meet Bombadil, they've been initiated, baptized, as it were, into the whole of Middle-earth. And now Merry is reflecting on what it feels like now that they've come full circle, right? We have left all the rest behind, the dwarves and the elves, and now Gandalf has left them, Gondor and Rohan, Mordor, everything else that they've been through is no longer there, right? And they're just going to be back home, back at the Shire. And Merry says, "It seems almost like a dream that has slowly faded." And Frodo says, "Not to me. To me, it feels more like falling asleep again." Now, this is a little backwards if you're familiar with things like, I don't know, Alice in Wonderland, where the adventure in Wonderland, in Fairy, in that other world, however the characters in the story get there, is to us in primary reality, in the way Tolkien talks about it, us in primary reality cast as a dream, right? So that the secondary reality is the dream that you fall into. Yet here Frodo is saying, coming back home to the Shire, now that our adventure is over, feels like falling asleep again. What's Tolkien playing with here? Well, 2 episodes ago we were talking about his time travel story, and I'd like to carry on with that a bit further. This is the Notion Club papers, and we're in night 61. This is in the story world. It's night 61, Thursday, February 27th, 1987. We talked about how the premise of the Notion Club papers is that they're discovered somewhat later, so the time travel element is already there. But why? What do dreams have to do with it? Well, remember I left off in the episode we were talking about what Raymer had been doing, right? And Dolbear has been asleep and waked up and said, well, you know, what have you been doing, right? And this sort of Dolbear is asking Raymer quite bluntly, what have you been up to, and what have you been seeing, right? And Raymer says, Imbaru, I don't see yet, Dolbear ended. So there's a question of vision here, but they've been talking about time travel. And if you remember from the previous episode, they've been talking about the problem of framing, right? So something that Merry and Frodo were talking about has to do with the frame story. We have the frame story of the Bombadil that they are inside of, and now Frodo was saying passing back through that frame feels like falling asleep, whereas he had been wide awake in the dream. Which is it? Well, here's a third thread, Raymer went on. I had the notion, as others probably have too, that for movement or traveling, like the hobbits go on a journey, right? That for movement or traveling, the mind, when abstracted from the flood of sense, might use the memory of the past and the foreshadowing of the future that resides in all things, including what we call inanimate matter. Okay, now this is just like totally out of the blue, right? They've been talking about time travel and arguing about how you could do that effectively, and Dolbear has been sort of nudging Raymer to explain what it is they've been doing. And we talked about this problem about the mind being in more than one place, but more properly where its attention is. But now Raymer has shifted to this idea of physical things, right? Matter. And that there's a memory of the past and the foreshadowing of the future in the stuff, right? And he says in what we call inanimate matter. Those are not the right words, but they'll have to do. I mean, perhaps the causal descent from the past and the casual probability in the present. I don't know, is it casual or causal? The U and the S are, that are implicit in everything. At any rate, I thought that might be one of the mind's vehicles, but an incarnate mind seemed rather a problem to me. Okay, they're still talking about time travel, but now they're suddenly talking about matter and the body and the mind and the relationship between the mind and the body. I hope that by the time this episode airs, some of you may have seen the episodes that I've done with E. Michael Jones on Logos. I think we're in that territory now. It will take a little bit of unpacking to get there, though. All right, so an incarnate mind seemed rather a problem to me, and not a very new one, said Guilford. Haha, right? So remember, Guilford is the secretary and the sort of medieval character that's in the storytelling, right? He's the moderator for the debate between the owl and the nightingale. Raymer laughed. Don't be too hard on me, he said. I'm not at all original. And anyway, my problem was practical rather than philosophical. I was puzzled about jumping. I didn't see how it could be done. I'm not a philosopher, but an experimenter, a man driven by desires, if not very fleshly ones, still incarnate ones. Being an incarnate mind, I am conditioned by time and space, even in my curiosities. Though being a mind, I want to get beyond the range of my own body's senses and history. Okay? No, Tolkien is trying to philosophize here, but he's doing so by way of these characters. So you get this sense of, this is kind of an experiment, as he's given Raymer the criterion to be using of saying, I wanted to know how to jump, which this is a lot of this just appears to come out of the blue, although it does have a source, as I'll show you. But that he's not a philosopher, but an experimenter who wants things, desires, but not fleshly things, but incarnate things nevertheless. He still wants to have some kind of relationship between what he can understand and being actually incarnate, conditioned by space and time, even in my curiosities. Though being a mind, I want to get beyond the range of my own body, senses, and history. Now, this seems to be what Tolkien is trying to overcome in his puzzling over what time travel would actually mean. It's not so much bouncing his body around in time, although that's usually the way we think of time travel, right? If you have Bill and Ted's Big, Great Adventure, whatever it was, Wonderful Adventure, and they travel by way of a magic device, more like a spaceship, like the is telephone booth, right? A device can carry them bodily from one time to another. And what Raymer is saying is, I wanted, as my mind, to get beyond what my body would be able to tell me all by it, just with its senses, right? So we want to have some kind of experiment that would satisfy the desire to be in other times, because we are incarnate and exist in time and space. This is the logos element, right? The incarnation into time has to be anchored in a particular moment, right? If you think about incarnation, well, okay, so a little bit of a digression. If you think about the incarnation of Christ, right, our God, and one of the things that I've always puzzled over is this problem of, well, why does God become incarnate when he does? And you realize, well, for God, from the God's perspective, there is, God is, if you can say God is in a place which is nominalist and therefore unorthodox and wrong and not terrifically medieval, but if you can imagine God is outside of time, right? And you can only do it by analogy with in space, right? If you say, here is our plane of existence, and we are living along it, as it were, in time, right? So if this is the page, or you could even say it's like we read a page, right? You're reading the page, and always in reading the page you're in time, but the author has a vision of the whole work. This is probably more accurate for Tolkien's thinking too. The author has a vision of the whole work and knows the whole at the same time, even though you as reader, or we can say we as incarnate souls, have to go linearly if we want to, participate in the story. That's what it's like. But God, when he becomes incarnate, like, when is it, right? If you'd flip the book and you'd say, stop, that's when God becomes incarnate. Well, what about all this previous stuff? I think I don't have my Bible to hand. That's wrong. What about all this previous stuff, the Old Testament stuff? Well, that's part of the story. That's part of the full story, right? But the moment when God says, I'm entering into time now, it's like it creates all of the time, because it creates the place in the story where that event happens, and then that it ripple effects into existence. So we as beings incarnate, souls incarnate in bodies in time, are to a certain extent fixed in our own time. Just like when Jesus becomes incarnate, he's fixed in the time in which he's become incarnate. But with our minds, want to be able to, he says, get beyond the range of that physical history that we have from our own senses. How are you going to do that? Of course, you might imagine the mind, by some special effort of its own, doing something analogous to the body's leaping from place to place, especially in a less trammeled state like sleep or trance. But I thought the analogy probably false, for a living man anchored even in trance to the body, however long and thin the rope. The mind may be neither in time nor space, except insofar as it's specially associated with the body. But while you're alive, the body holds. I thought, mind, body, they jump together, or neither jumps at all. Okay, so Raymer is hypothesizing it's not two different ways. You could imagine the body hopping about in time, and he says that's unsatisfying. Or you could imagine the mind hopping about and the body staying in place. And that is a device that, it's used a lot in storytelling. And that okay, now I've just thought of the analogy that I was going to use that is in fact closer to Tolkien's. It's not this one. But it's like the body goes into a trance and the mind gets to travel through space and time and be in all these other places, but the body still stays in time. And Raymer's saying, no, that's dissatisfying to me. I want something where they both go together, that there's some material link with the mind, not just a sort of thread of association between the body and the mind, but mind. He wants mind, body, they jump together, or neither jumps at all. I hardly need to say again that by jump I do not mean the movement of thought to objects already in its grasp, or memory, shifting instantaneously, say, from considering the peculiar configuration of Rufus's face to thinking of Table Mountain, which I once saw. I wanted to observe new things far off in time and space, beyond the compass of a terrestrial animal. So it's not just all of the precision that he's trying to get here. It's not just that he wants to turn his attention in his imagination to thinking about something else, right? He could say, I hold Rufus's face in my mind and I'm thinking about it, and then I want to think about the Table Mountain instead. No, I want to see things far off in space and time, beyond what I've been able to experience with my senses on Earth. Now, remember, the whole point of this exercise was to write a time travel story that was complementary to Lewis's space travel story, and they've been talking about the way in which Tolkien didn't like the space travel device that Lewis came up with, and he's trying to give himself a better device. So Raymer thinks he's figured it out, right? And he says, but I didn't want to die, and I thought that all I could do was refine my observation of other things that have moved and will move, to inspect the history of things whose paths at some point of time and space crossed the path of my body. Okay, so now he has a method, which you could say is like, it's basically what historians do, but he's saying, he realized that to travel in the way that he was imagining, he'd need to have objects that themselves had traveled, and that if he could anchor himself to in some way, he could travel with them, right? So he says the mind uses the memory of its body. Could it use other memories, or rather records? What kind of record of past events and forms could there be? In the time sequence, the disintegration of a form destroys the memory or the special record of the history of that form, unless it has got into a mind first. The fragments, right down to the smallest units, no doubt preserve the record of their own particular history, and that may include some of the history of the combinations they've entered into. But take a haunted house, for instance. Okay, so this is, I think, and Christopher's notes in this are not terrifically satisfying, and I know Verlyn Flieger, I'm going to be drawing some of her studies of this story, on some of Verlyn Flieger's studies of the story to make sense of it, but some of the specifics here are very peculiar, and I'm wondering whether they're peculiar to Tolkien, but this feels to me like Aristotle, right? And you know what happened to me last time when I did stuff off the top of my head and I had to come back and correct it. So, watch this space if you want to know whether I was right this time. But this disintegration of form destroys the memory or the special record of the history of that form. This seems to me to be this. It's necessary that the form that the thing is in, the matter is in, that Raymer is going to use for his traveling, holds itself together, right? And there's an incarnational and very Catholic problem here with which is the resurrection of the body, right? That when we die, our bodies decay, but there's a long scholastic discussion throughout the Middle Ages over exactly what that means for the uh, doctrine of the resurrection of the body. Not just Christ rose from the dead, but that all of us rise. And how do you do that? It has to be somehow your matter to rise. And, how do you end up with, looking like yourself, the form that you had? Can God take any matter that was out there and make you again with new matter, but to the form that you had, or did it need to be your own matter? Scholastics did not worry about angels on the heads of pins because they knew that angels didn't locate in space that way. But they did worry about, the cannibal baby problem, right? It's like the baby ate only embryos of other human beings, therefore had no matter of its own, his or her own. At the resurrection, whose matter would he have? So there's this Aristotelian layering to the problem of the subsistence of form, soul. The soul is the form of the body with the matter of the body. And not Jeremy. Jeremy's coming in here. He's the one talking about the house. Raymer is wanting to find things that are durable in both matter and form. And then he's going to give this example of a house. Now, Jeremy interrupts and says, all houses are haunted. And, to the idea that the inhabited form has some kind of life to it, which if you think about, you're going to have to keep up with all of these. You can always go back and watch again because the videos are up. But when we talked about Tolkien's concern with Beowulf as a poem, and he had that image of the tower that got knocked over, and from the tower you could see the sea, that he's very concerned with matter arranged, right? Matter properly arranged by the artist in a particular form. And here he does it with houses, right? And they have a little conversation about houses, saying, it's like if you had simply the lumber from the house or the stones from the house, and it had all been blown apart. Or another example, Humpty Dumpty, right? If Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall and you put all his pieces together again, you just have an eggshell, right? There needs to be some continuity between the shaping of the matter and the inhabitation of the soul of that matter. This is going to come into Tolkien's meditation on the relationship between elves and men and their mortality and immortality, when he calls their Fia and Hror. I'm sure some of you know this, but those of you who don't, footnote. All of this goes into this problem of the significance of incarnation, which is body formed to a soul. And Raymer says in order to travel in the way that he would like, he needs matter that has traveled through time and space, like an object that a craftsman had made in the past, presumably. It's like, well, this one is a replica, so it wouldn't work. Right? But if you had or my ivories, which aren't, they're wax, if you had those original objects and what would you do with them? But somehow you could make a connection with the past by way of this object itself that had traveled through time. That Raymer is thinking is going to be his method. And he explains over the next several exchanges how he practiced becoming aware of the memory of things. Now, this to me is hilarious, right? Because there is this, it's not so recent anymore, maybe the last 10 years or so, conversation in my academic field in medieval studies about, the memory of objects and how we could get at history by way of the memory of things. Well, Tolkien's there already. He's been theorizing this in advance of everybody else. And actually, I don't know this, but I don't think the people that have been theorizing the memory of things were reading Tolkien. But he's much more. They're just talking about studying material objects and understanding that there is a history to the materials that are put together by people. Although usually in this, it's kind of an art history and archaeology field. This thing stuff. They get the objects in the museums and they want to, I guess, do what Tolkien's doing with touch them and it's almost like it's a little seancey, right? If I can touch this thing and get the memories off of it, of the people who held it or something like that, then it'll be significant. But Tolkien, like these material object scholars, wants the thing to tell him stories. He wants, and that Raymer talks about how it's hard to concentrate properly, and it took him a lot of practice. I'm all into this stuff, right? When I was about the age I was reading Tolkien, I was also reading, the books on ESP that you get at the elementary school, no, middle school library. I was in middle school by this time, 6th grade, and desperate to get the exercises and making the cup float to work, right? Well, here's Raymer, talking about how he's trained his memory, and he keeps training it on different kinds of things, and how he trained himself for, he says, well, historical inspection and awareness, that he's by touching be a little, go around Oxford and hold on to the objects, and try to get yourself into the mind of the object, or it's not mind, it's, again, they're theorizing off it, but he, in the midst of this, he's also training himself to dream. So there's this crossover between he's taking his attention, he's wanting these objects that can travel in time, and then he's training, he says, remember, I was also training my memory on dreams at the same time, and that is how I discovered that the other experiments affected them. Though they were blurred by the waking senses beyond recognition, I found that these other perceptions were not wholly unnoted. They were like things that are passed over when one is abstracted or distracted, but that are really taken in and asleep. The mind, rootling about as it does in the day's leavings or the weeks, would inspect them again with far less distraction and all the force of its original desire. So he's going around basically touching objects and trying to attend to their memory, he says, and at the same time he's training himself in his dreams to pay attention to his dreams, so that he's as it were widening the scope of his attention. And all of this is as a way, he says, of being able to somehow travel mind and body together. He sees this as that kind of thing, because he says, but all that time, of course, I wanted to get off the earth. So the time travel is kind of space travel, in fact. That's how I got the notion of studying a meteorite instead of mooning about with houses, ruins, trees, boulders, and all sorts of other things. There's a very large meteorite in a park, Gunthorpe Park in Matfield, which Tolkien, Christopher's note says he can't figure out what that is, so it's perhaps imaginary for the sake of the story. Where I lived as a boy after we came back from abroad, even then it had a strange fascination for me. I wondered if it could have come from Malacandra, which is in Lewis's space trilogy Mars, right? So there's a lot of interleaving and crossover between the space trilogy and this conversation, and in effect Tolkien's trying to outdo Lewis in his transport. Saying, I've got this meteorite, Raymer's saying, I've got this meteorite, and I'm wondering whether it came from Malacandra, and I went and I sort of learned to listen to it, or learned to touch it. Indeed, I took the hobnobbing with it again in the backs in the vacation. Indeed, I made myself ridiculous, Benny did, story-wise, and an object of suspicion. I wanted to visit the stone alone at night to lessen the distractions, but I was not allowed to. Closing hours were closing hours, so I gave that up. It seemed to be quite without results. So the poor old stone was left all alone, said Loudon. Yes, said Raymer, it was. It is a very long way indeed from home, and it is very lonely. So now we get it, that he has actually managed to contact, as it were, the memory of the meteorite that he's been hanging out with in the park, and learned that the rock is very, very far away from home. And frankly, which is the C.S. Lewis character, right? It says, traveling on a dream meteor. So that's your method, is it? And Raymer says, no, not if you mean how I got the news of Emberu that I put in my tale. But I did work back into the meteorite's history, I think, though that sort of vehicle does not readily give place or time or references. So yes and no, right? He keeps hedging. And you realize methodologically, this is what Tolkien tends to do. It's like he's constantly dissatisfied because he hates the mechanical, but on the other hand, he wants it to be incarnate, right? So he's the tension that he always ends up with in these sort of philosophical meditations is he wants the experiment to work, and he wants it to be real, and he wants the mind-body connection to be there, because it all is always ultimately incarnational, right? And he uses the word incarnation constantly. It's the incarnation that this is a meditation on, which means it's theological, right? There's that problem of the maker of all things and how he relates to his creatures. But Tolkien is also always going to veer away whenever it starts becoming too mechanical. Okay, so Raymer says no. He got various impressions off the meteorite of weight and fire and endlessness, being part of the foundations of a continent and upholding immeasurable tons of rock for countless ages, waiting for an explosion or world-shattering shock. All of these things. So he got used to all of this, and then he kept dreaming more and more. And it says, I found it all very disturbing. Not what I wanted, or at least not what I'd hoped for. I saw anyway that it would take far too much of a mortal human life to get accustomed to this kind of vehicle, that one could use it properly or selectively. So the meteorite's too hard, difficult, and although he could get impressions off of it, it's as if the meteorite gave him too much time to work with, and he was never going to get, in his own human existence, doesn't have enough time to take in the meteorite's time. So he said, I gave it up. No doubt when any degree of control was achieved, my mind would no longer have been limited to that particular vehicle or chunk of matter. The waking mind is not confined to the memories, heredity, or senses of its own normal vehicle, its body. So it could have worked. It's like he got the memory off the mirror, and he was starting to get better at it, but that wasn't going to be the vehicle that gave him the kind of journey that he wanted. So I turned more than ever to dream inspection, trying to get deeper down. I attended to dreams in general, but more and more to those least connected with the immediate irritations of the body's senses. And he started getting significance of things and different stories, and then something happened. For about that time, something decisive happened. It seemed to sweep away all the other trials and experiments. Experiment is very important here. These testing out this method, right? But I don't think they were really wasted. I think they had a good deal with precipitating the catastrophe. Come on, what was it? Said Dolbear. He stopped snoring and sat up. So Dolbear just woke up. It was most like a violent awakening, said Raymer. And then he stares at the ceiling. At last he went on. Imagine an enormously long, vivid, and absorbing dream being shattered, say, simultaneously by an explosion in the house, a blow on your body, and the sudden flinging back of dark curtains, letting in a dazzling light, with the result that you come back with a rush to your waking life and have to recapture it and its connections, feeling for some time a shock in the color of dream emotions, like falling out of one world into another where you had been but had forgotten it. Well, that was what it was like in reverse, only recapturing the connections was slower. I was awake in bed, and I fell wide asleep. As suddenly and violently as the waker in my illustration, I dived slap through several levels in a whirl of shapes and scenes into connected and remembered sequence. I could remember all the dreams I ever had of that sequence. At least I remembered that I could remember them while I was still there, better than I can here remember a long sequence of events in waking life. And the memory did not vanish when I woke up, and it hasn't vanished. It has dimmed down to normal, to about the same degree as a memory of waking life. It's edited, blanks indicating lack of interest, some transitions cut, and so on. But my dream memories are no longer fragments, no longer like pictures, about the size of my circle of vision with fixed eyes, surrounded with dark, as they used to be, nearly always. They are wide and long and deep. I visited many other sequences since then, and I can now remember a very great number of serious, free dreams, my deep dreams, since I first had any. Right. He fell wide asleep. Right, now, there's that, what did I do with that when the hobbits have come back, And Mary says, it seems like a dream that has slowly faded. And Frodo says, it feels to me like falling asleep again. Which way are we going? Right? That Tolkien has, while he was working on finishing Lord of the Rings, worked out this theory that he develops in the Notion Club papers of being able to fall wide asleep. Right? And I've never seen that movie Eyes Wide Shut, so I don't know what that's about. What is interesting, one, again, the sort of resonance with these meditations that Tolkien is having back in 1944 or so, writing out on paper that he had from 1940, pretending that it's in 1987, which is discovered in 2012, right? That he is convinced that there's this actual experimental method for expanding his attention by way of meditating with the memory of physical objects, but that if he can train himself in his dream perception to open his it's like, he doesn't ever use mystical language, right? He's not talking about like opening his third eye or something like that, but that it almost gets there. It's like, and the eye in my Christian reading from, say, the Song of Songs, there's the soul is asleep on her bed, right? The soul is the bride in the Song of Songs, and she's I sleep, but my heart keeps watch, right? Every time I see that, I fell wide asleep. That feels like that, right? It feels like the soul is asleep, the I sleep, but my heart is wide awake. And Tolkien's character, and you're wondering whether Tolkien actually managed to do this, because he's been saying that he's trying to figure out how this understanding of dreaming can help him with his time travel to find the Atlantis story, right? That if he can open his soul, open his mind, and fall wide asleep, he's going to be able to have this panoramic vision. And they ask him, well, how long have you been doing this? And Raymer gives this sort of odd saying, well, I've gone back in the history of the universe, but I can't say that I've been, I began dreaming with the creation of my soul and my birth and things like that. It goes back and forth, trying to stay constantly anchored in his lifetime, but with that anchoring still, being born, as he says, somewhere in 1929, but that 50 odd years of our time could contain indefinite lengths of experience or operation or journey. So they're saying, how long have you been doing this? Well, I've been back to the beginning of the universe in my falling wide asleep. But I know that it's all happened within my incarnate time of some 50 odd years. Well, so they have a bit more so that they're curious about, well, how do you do that? What's it like? And he gives them some examples of scenes that he's had. Sort of, it's like there's first like a kind of snapshot flash, and then he gets the rest of the story with it. So there's this sort of, it's very cinematic, and it's interesting that Tolkien was in his lifetime pretty resistant to people putting his stories on in film, because when they'd write like treatments of it for him and he'd hate them. We know that he hated the Disneyfication of dwarves and things like that. But he never felt like the screenwriters that gave him possibilities for how they would visualize his stuff got it right. And you could say he has very clear visual images that he wants to be able to translate into drawings or film, as it were, but it's always somewhat dissatisfying. And here we have these, it's like you can see this flash of light, and we have this little this one snapshot of a story, and then he gives them a bit more detailed. There's one of a house and another of a man in a room with some books that he tells the stories, but that they those are just examples for him of saying, I get this, and then I get the whole story. So going back to our understanding of God's perception, in time of, from God's perception, and here we are in time, that Raymer is saying he's managed by way of his dream practice and falling wide asleep to be able to, the comparison that he gives is coming back over and over and over again to a book that you've read before, right? So he's able to go back in his dreams, like if he's seen it once, he can go back and see it again, and it's still there, and it's sort of, they're fixed, which starting to, it's like, is this actually time travel, or is it just reading a lot of dreams? And if you, mostly it's not, I want to go back in time and fix the past. The sort of trope in time travel stories, right, that he wants to have access to the stories in the way a historian or a philologist would, and have the sensation. It talks a lot about how Raymer talks a lot about how he gets the emotions of the scenes that he is observing as well, so that he is affected by them and absorbed into them, but it's not like he's an actor in them, although the sort of desire to go back gets a little complicated when they do end up in the Atlantis part of the story. But he says there's sort of a drama in them, and starts sort of eliding whether he's traveling or writing these scenes, right? He says, well, Raymer went on, the whole story as it is told becomes visible and audible, and the composer is inside it. This is the God theological incarnational problem, but here he is dreaming it. Does God dream us? Dreaming it and telling the story at the same time, though he can take his stand in some odd positions, often high up, unless he puts himself into the play as he can at any moment. The scenes look real but are feigned, and the composition is not complete like a slice of life. It can be given in selected scenes. As it can, when you're working over it again or merely re-inspecting it, be reviewed in any order and at varying speeds, like rereading or reconsidering a book. I think that is one, though only one, of the reasons why the memory of such dreams, when any survives at all, is so often dissolving or jumbled. The dreamer is aware, of course, that he is author and producer, at any rate while he is at work asleep, but he can get far more absorbed by his work than a waking man is by any book or play that he is either writing or reading, and he can feel the emotions very strongly, excessively sometimes, because they are heightened by the excitement of combining authorship with an acting part, and in memory they may be exaggerated still more through getting dislocated, abstracted from the sounds and scenes that would explain them. So now it's not remember that this started with the setting that the night before they were asking Raymer to read something, and then they said, you made that up, but you made up that frame, but you didn't make up the part in the middle, and the part in the middle felt real to them, like it had actually happened, but they weren't sure why, because the frame was so clunky. And now Raymer is explaining that in fact it did happen, but there's this elision between whether he's invented it or whether he's dreamed, invented, composed it, arranged it, authored it, participated in it while watching it. And now they want him to explain some of the elvish dreams that he has. Well, here are some of my fragments of this kind. There is the empty throne on top of a mountain. There is a green wave, white-crested, fluted, and scallop-shaped, but vast, towering above green fields, often with a wood of trees, too, that has constantly appeared. I saw several times a scene in which a wide plain lay before the feet of a steep ridge on which I stood. The opposing sky was immense, rising as a vertical wall, not bending to a vault, ablaze with stars strewn almost regularly over all its expanse. That is an omen or presage of catastrophe. A dark shape sometimes passes across the sky, only seen by blotting out the stars as it goes. Then there is the tall, gray, round tower on the sheer end of the land. The sea cannot be seen, for it is too far below, too immeasurably far, but it can be smelt. And over again, in many stages of growth and many different lights and shadows, 3 tall trees, slender, foot to foot on a green mound, covered and crowned with an embracing halo of blue and gold. And what do you think they all mean? Asked Franklin. Well, and then they're trying to figure out whether they're mythical or symbolic, and what those mean. But certainly you can recognize features of Middle Earth in what Raymer has been dreaming, right? So that Merry and Frodo are sort of trying to decide whether or not they've been there on the journey that they have, or whether it's been a dream. Which is it? It's like, and when Frodo says he feels like returning home is like falling asleep again. Does that mean the Shire is more real to him? The Shire is less real to him than where they've been, or vice versa? And because Merry and Frodo have completely opposite perceptions of which is the dream, but also because Raymer is not clear. It's like these stories that he's been observing in his dreams have now become more real to him than his waking life. But he's awake, asleep, wide asleep, right? So wide asleep and sleeping awake, and what's real? He has, but it's still incarnate, right? And he says, for example, are the blessed trees religious symbolisms? Asked Jeremy. No, not more than all things mythical are, not directly, but one does sometimes see and use symbols directly religious, and more than symbols. One can pray in dreams, or adore, I think I do sometimes, but there is no memory of such states or acts. One does not revisit such things. They're not really dreams. They're a third thing. They belong somewhere else, to the other anchorage, which is not to the body, and differ from dreams more than dream from waking. Dreaming is not death. The mind is still, as I say, anchored to the body. It is all the time inhabiting the body, so far as it is in anywhere, and therefore in time and space, attending to them. It is meant to be so. But most of you will agree that there has probably been a change of plan, and it looks as if the cure is to give us a dose of something higher and more difficult. Mind you, I'm only talking of the seeing and learning side, not for instance of morality. But we feel terribly loose without the anchor. Maybe with the support of the stronger and wiser, it could be celestial, but without them it could be bitter and lonely, a spiritual meteorite in the dark looking for a world to land on. I dare say many of us are in for some lonely cold before we get back. Okay, so all of that is getting, as it were, even more mystical and odd. And we're back to that insistence, though, that this has to be happening in body, and it has to be happening with that anchor. As with everything, we're always to the point now where we say, well, how seriously did Tolkien take all of this? He's been talking about experimenting. He's been talking about this happening in the body, and he means it to be happening. He's been talking about it almost as if it's practical. This, he wants it to be anchored. He wants this method to be anchored, not just in. I don't know. I suppose the kind of anchor that the believability of me trying to play ESP with a plastic cup when I was 11. But Tolkien's writing this as a grown up and wanting to have some kind of, well, what's he up to? Well, this sense of, we've noted a few places where Tolkien seems to be prophesying things that people later will be concerned about, like the haunted houses, or the falling wide asleep, or I forgot what the other one was. But all of this talk about time, well, time, how's it? Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future. You recognize what I'm reading? And time future is contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. What might have been is an abstraction, remaining a perpetual possibility, only in a world of speculation. What might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present. You think that's T.S. Eliot, just being poetic, right? So this is burnt Norton. And he's time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future. mysticism, poetic license. Bert Norton, interestingly enough, for the theme of our exercise here, Bert Norton's actually about a house that burned down. It was Norton House, and the manor house burnt in 1741, and T.S. Eliot visited it in 1934. He published this poem in 1936, so around the same time that Tolkien is writing roughly, his Notion Club papers. Is this simply a coincidence? Is there such a thing as time travel? Well, they thought there was, or they hoped there was, because both T.S. Eliot and Tolkien, and in fact C.S. Lewis, along with a number of their other contemporaries, were very taken up with a particular book called An Experiment in Time by J.W. Dunn. It was published in 1927, and what's interesting about it is, one, remember that C.S. Lewis and Tolkien toss up about time travel, and Dunn called what he was trying to understand an experiment in time. But I'll give you one guess what his mechanism was. So Dunn, in fact, he's a very interesting character because he's in fact originally an aeronautical engineer. He's an aircraft engineer and worked on their tails, right, so that the planes would fly more stably. But he got very interested, starting in 1898, with the fact that he would dream certain things, and the dreams would apparently come true, right? And rather than thinking of himself, this curious sort of thing, what he said was he was doing an experiment, and that he started writing his dreams down. So you can see Raymer in Tolkien's meditation doing this experiment. Well, that it's an experiment that Raymer wants to be up to is Tolkien giving his character J.W. Dunn's exercise in trying to find out whether you could train yourself not just to remember your dreams, but to attend to your dreams and see whether they pointed you to anything that happened later. And this is all going to have a massive effect on our understanding of the way in which Tolkien understands, for example, Lothlorien. But it's also hinted at, if you remember, when the hobbits are in the House of Tom Bombadil, and they all have dreams. Frodo has the dream that we learn later is Gandalf walking about on the tower and being rescued from Orthanc. Pippin has the dream of the trees. Merry has the dream of drowning, and Sam simply floats and sleeps. One of my friends in comments on that episode says it's like a log. Everybody else is submerged in their dreams, and Sam is undisturbed by it. He's not there dreaming. The others have dreams that, well, Frodo finds out actually show him something true that's happening at the time that he's dreaming, right? And so there, in this sense, J.W. Dunn and Tolkien, in his understanding, they're not so much traveling through time so that you're not jumping like in Bill and Ted's magic phone booth. They're not jumping around, but expanding their field of vision. Now, what's interesting about this is J.W. Dunn, I have his book in PDF. Unfortunately, I can't show it to you in real because all I have is the PDF form. But he has this desire to sort of make the relativity work, as it were, right? So I've done it here on the board. And you say that we in our experience are like traveling along this line, right? And most of the time our attention is only like looking at ourselves on front of that line. And what Dunn imagines, and he does it by way of this, sort of, he's going to make the line cross, and you go, here's G prime, and here's O prime, and here's H prime. it's not really clear how that he's able to make the graphs, one, obviously add an effort to make this Einsteinian, and theory of relativity, that the position of the observer affects the what you see, the ball being thrown out of the train. It's that kind of sort of widening the perception. What he's trying to say here is that if you could widen your perception so that you're here, you could then see and this is, you could see H prime, G prime, and instead of just being trapped on this line, you could widen and widen and widen. And what Dunn gets to, sorry, I didn't mark that. What Dunn gets to eventually is trying to do this sort of three-dimensional thing with multiple planes, and that if you widen your attention, you could never mind, right? Because in a certain sense, the diagrams are sort of magic tricks on their own. The premise, though, was it captivated people like Tolkien, it captivated people like T.S. Eliot, particularly in the 30s, and if you have a lot of time travel stories coming out of that period, many of them are influenced by J.W. Dunn and this exercise of saying it's not so much that we could travel in time, but we could expand our perception to be seeing the rest of it, right? So it's like Flatland, if you know that story, right? That the objects live on a plane, and so they can only see themselves as like if the triangle, you see a triangle, it's just going to be a point and then spreading out, but the sphere drops down through the plane, and the triangle, I think it's the triangle character, right, can see the sphere as a widening line. And then they're very interested in this period with the idea of if you could get yourself into a different dimension, which is what I think is going on here. He's trying to show you this exercise of imagining yourself out of the linear dimension into a dimension where if you were from this perspective, you could see that whole sequence, right? That what Dunn, he ends up calling it serialism, right? If you could get outside of experiencing time this way and be able to see this whole field, which we can in the drawing, which is why I think it's hard to see this, because you have to first imagine yourself only being able to see there, and then voila, I can see all of time. That you're not actually there, but you're physically still anchored in that perception. So when Raymer says, well, I've only been doing this since I was actually born, that's what he means, that he in his serial experience, it's only going to be what he's lived through, but in his dream experience and his communing with a meteorite, he's been able to expand his field of attention to the point where he can both participate in the meteorite's memory and dream himself into these other places that he has somehow anchored himself to with his objects. So where did he go? And was it real? And to what extent could he go there in anything other than dream? Well, they're going to carry on with the conversation, and we'll carry on. We'll revisit this for a few more episodes with different elements of it. They have a long conversation about language. They have some conversation. They have some adventures, in fact, with the great storm that hits. Right, we foreshadowed that. But for the moment, there's this very interesting conclusion that they come to that seems to suggest, well, exactly where is Raymer able to travel? And sometimes he says he has this perception that it comes from somewhere else. But out of some place, beyond the region of dreams, now and again, there comes a blessedness. And it soaks through all the levels and illumines all the scenes through which the mind passes out back into waking. And so it flows out into this life. There it lasts long, but not forever in this world, and memory cannot reach its source. Often we ascribe it to the pictures seen on the margin, radiant in its light, and as we pass by and out. But a mountain far in the north, caught in a slow sunset, is not the sun. So they've been talking about religious symbolism, and here I think if Tolkien is haunted by his Atlantis dream, he's clearly also haunted by his Land of the Blessed dream, and whether that's a heaven dream and exactly what kind of relationship Earth and heaven have to each other. I mean, this is a man who wrote multiple stories about what he called Middle Earth, right? But his characters, one in the characters in Middle Earth want access to that blessed land, the blessed realm, to Valinor, and the persistent question for the characters in the Lord of the Rings, and for Tolkien in his own imagining of fairy, right, is to what degree is that secondary reality, which is heaven, or is it? We probably need to talk about Leaf by Niggle, because that plays with this problem as well. To what extent is it sort of a continuation of our present existence, and to what extent is it not? And given that what Raymer's been doing in this exercise is talking about how this happens to happen with incarnation, and going back to what I said about those scholastics with their desire to understand the resurrection of the body, it's like the problem of the mind-body relationship to our both imagination and our access to the blessed. And we'll learn, for example, that Tolkien is very devoted to the sacrament, right? That the sacraments are always about this material connection that we have to the divine. Is not quite right, because I think people, it's like divine, if you just think about that godly, right? Divine in this problem is the heavenly Jerusalem, right? The whole expanse of what it means to be in God's presence. And Raymer is a little bit this blessedness, right, that soaks through, and he's not really quite sure how to ascribe it. He also notes, and this is a little more nervous making, but you say if the one thing you wanted to see things, what if you wanted to have contact with other minds? And Raymer says indeed he has been, sometimes just as he is out there noticing things, touching on them with his mind, he notices other minds noticing him. Now, of course, I feel like we're in a video game or something, and Tolkien's imagining virtual reality, and there you are with your character, which I don't do this, right? So I'm going to have to rely on you all to explain to me whether I get this analogy correct. But that you're out there in virtual world, you're in your game platform with your character, and notice other characters who come into contact with you, and here they are, as Raymer is describing. Some other minds do that occasionally to me, sort of get onto other vehicles, right? So he's been traveling on his meteor with his attention and his dream, and he notices other minds trying to do that to him, and even as he's doing it. Their resting on me need not be noticed, I think, or hardly at all. I mean, it need not affect me or interfere with me at all, but when they are doing so and are in contact, then my mind can use them. The two minds don't tell stories to one another, even if they're aware of the contact. They are just in contact and can learn. Now, I said that there was another sort of story analog that I occurred to me is like this, and I've talked about Terry Pratchett before in the witches stories. You may be familiar with Granny Weatherwax, who can do her borrowing, right? So when she has to have a sign on her body when she's doing this, because it says "I ain't dead." She's lying down with her sign that says "I ain't dead" and borrowing a body, right? So she's somehow sent her mind out, and she borrows bats, and she's a witch, right? So she's doing this sort of kind of playing with the tradition of witches familiar that she can take on, but Granny's good at this, so she can do it with other creatures. And so she takes her mind and sort of borrows the body and sees through the eyes of the owl or the rabbit, or rabbits are not good because they're too frightened, but that she can get in the mind and travel. And Raymer sort of plays off of saying that he can do that. It's not that they're talking to each other, but just somehow learning from each other. After all, a wandering mind, if it's all like mine, will be much more interested in having to look at what the other knows than in trying to explain to the stranger the things that are familiar to itself. And his friends then say, well, what are they? It's like ghosts. And he says, well, yes, ghosts, but things, minds that know things, he says, a very long way indeed from here. You can see in this Tolkien's continuing desire to have that contact with other incarnate minds is a regular feature of his desire. We're going to revisit that a number of times, but here Raymer is saying while he's out there dream traveling, attention traveling, other minds can contact his too. And wondering that they can probably get at us awake, distracted, and not so aware. Some of them, however, are a little bit more frightening, right? It's not always comfortable. Sometimes a frightening is sort of knocking at the door. It doesn't describe it, that'll do. I think this is one of the ways in which that horrible sense of fear arises, a fear that doesn't seem to reside in the remembered dream situation at all, or wildly exceeds it. I'm not much better off than anyone else on this point, for when that fear comes, it usually produces a kind of dream concussion, and a passage is erased around the true fear point. So you can't remember it, he says. But there are some dreams that can't be fully translated into sight and sound. I can only describe them as resembling such a situation as this. Working alone, late at night, withdrawn wholly into yourself, a noise, or even a nothing sensible, startles you. You get prickles all over, become acutely self-conscious, uneasy, aware of isolation. How thin the walls are between you and the night, capital Night. That situation may have various explanations here, but out or down, there sometimes the mind is suddenly aware that there is a night outside and enemies walk in it. One is trying to get in. But there are no walls, said Raymer somberly. The soul is dreadfully naked when it notices it, when that is pointed out to it by something alien. It has no armor on it. It has only its being. But there is a guardian. He seems to command precipitate retreat. You could, if you were a fool, disobey, I suppose. You could push him away. You could have got into a state in which you were attracted by the fear, but I can't imagine it. I'd rather talk about something else. Now that is a very interesting little moment. To say that Tolkien, he was reading Donne, he and C.S. Lewis were reading Donne. He's trying to give Raymer some kind of practice with what he says is an experiment. How much was Tolkien trying this himself? How much is he describing his own practice of dreaming and paying attention, or whether he's just giving it to this character to theorize off of because he's stuck in his storytelling otherwise? But he gives this kind of dream perception to his hobbits. They have dreams and they can see, and for example with Mirror of Galadriel, when Sam and Frodo are given a vision, right, what is it exactly that they see? Is it something that's going to pass? Is it complete? It's like these dreams that Raymer is describing, practicing with, but that Tolkien also gives Raymer this caution to say something is out there paying attention and you maybe don't want to attract it. This is a regular warning that mystics give in prayer. For example, the Hesychasts. There's a 14th century practice on Mount Athos that St. Gregory Palamas is famous for, of training. They train their attention by, they say, put your beard to your chest. Women are not supposed to be doing it. Put your beard to your chest and practice this particular kind of circular breathing that gave them an impression of this light, right? With that blessedness, that they understood it as the light that shown from Christ Jesus on Mount Tabor at the Transfiguration, right? That it's a real divine light that's the true light of that heaven. And they had contemporaries from the old, no, I'm doing it off the top of my head, sorry, I forgot. Barlaam of Calabria. I thought that's Barlaam and Josephat. I may have gotten that name wrong. Anyway, they were called navel gazers because they're teased, basically, and saying that's not, you're just inducing that in yourself as a kind of physical effect, and that physical effect that you're giving of seeing a light has nothing to do with the divine light. But the hesychasts themselves, they're achieving this great stillness, right? A lot of what Raymer describes as needing in his training of attention needs to be quiet. He wanted the meteorite to be quiet and to be there with the meteorite quiet. This does feel like a highly developed meditational practice, but as I heard Vox Day talk about this on his own dark streams a lot, right? Don't, meditation's a little dangerous. You don't necessarily want those minds paying attention to you. And here Raymer gets his point of saying, in that dream practice, oh yes, I've had minds watching me and coming to talk to me and touch me and getting together with me, but sometimes there's a fear in a night. This, to me, raises some very interesting questions about what Tolkien was actually up to. It feels to me like a dream that we've been in. No, says Frodo. It feels to me like falling asleep all over again. Are we dreaming or are we awake? To be continued. Thank you for joining me.